A lot about the presence of everyone here this morning, and I encourage you to be taking out your Bibles and following along with me over the next few moments this morning, and that's what I have to say this evening by God's Word. And I hope that we'll find it to be the truth, and we'll take it and apply it in every walks of life to be better servants of God in the future than we have in the past. This evening, if you want, you can read Jeremiah chapter 1. We won't be spending a great deal of time in that text. This evening we're going to talk about the topic, do not say I am but a youth. Response of Jeremiah when he's called to be a prophet in Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 7. And so what we'll talk about this evening, Lord willing, is the value that those that are youth can provide to the body of Christ. So Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 7 will be our starting point if you want to get the context of where that occurs in Jeremiah 1. But that is the plans for this evening. You know, this last week has been an absolutely beautiful week weather-wise. I'm sure we're all glad to get a reprieve from the cold that we have had on and off for months now. I'm sure we all enjoyed what really didn't feel like spring, felt more like it was summertime, having some warm temperatures in the mid-80s. But as the weather warms up, and as we enjoy nice, beautiful days outside, it comes to the time of year in which we have to address the topic of modesty. We have to address the topic of modesty. The way that one dresses, as we'll see later on, has a lot to say about an individual. Has a lot to say about an individual. And so we need to ask ourselves the question, what is the purpose in the way that I dress? As we'll move farther into the lesson this morning, we'll understand that the way that we dress will send messages. Perhaps messages we do not intend, but the way that we dress sends messages. It is possible for one to dress in a way that is found sexually attractive by a member of the opposite sex. So we have to ask ourselves this question, am I dressing in a way that may be sexually attractive to a member of the opposite sex? What exactly is sexually attractive dress? Let's consider that over the next few moments this evening, but let's understand again before we get in. Such studies are badly needed. Such studies are badly needed for us to understand the importance of modesty and what the Bible has to say on the topic. I'm afraid at times what we end up doing is we address the topic of modesty and we just leave it after we need to dress modestly. So that we all agree. But we need to understand what the Bible defines as being modest dress, which is the opposite of this sexually attractive dress. Now, not all will accept 100% what is said. You may listen and may disagree. There may be some who accept and do not 100% conform to the principle. That's unfortunately the way things go at times. But I do ask you to give this a fair and honest hearing, because over the next few moments I will speak plainly and bluntly about the way that we dress and the message that it sends. And so we need to understand what it says, and so I will speak plainly and bluntly about what the Bible has to say and how the way that one dresses is viewed by members of the opposite sex. We'll have some quotes here later on in the final. Let's talk for a few moments this morning about sexually attractive dress. Let's understand first and foremost, before we get into the Bible's definition of modesty, what is modest dress, and all of these other things, we need to understand that it is possible that one can dress in a way that is sexually attractive. We already said that it was possible, and simply had to ask ourselves the question, is that how I'm dressing? Let's understand that one can dress that way. Take your Bibles and turn to Proverbs chapter 7. Proverbs chapter 7 and in verse 10. Proverbs 5, 6, and 7 is the unit of 3 chapters in which Solomon is warning his son about the immoral woman. Some translations say the strange woman. She's immoral. She's the forbidden woman. This is the one he has no right to be with. And in describing her in verse 10, it says, and behold, the woman meets him there, dressed as a prostitute, wily of heart. Some translations say she's dressed with the attire of a harlot. How exactly she's dressed is not told, but there was something about her that when you saw her, you understood the profession she was in was that of being a prostitute. The way that she was dressed in the message, and she was dressed in some way that as a prostitute would have been found sexually attractive. Now we need to understand that one being sexually attractive, to a member of the opposite sex is not wrong. In Proverbs chapter 5, in the same unit of chapters, just earlier, a few chapters earlier, in Proverbs chapter 5, and in verse 15, Solomon told his son, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. What he's describing, as you go through the context, he says, drink water from your own cistern. Continue on. Verse 18, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. That's what he's talking about. Is the sexual relationship being enjoyed with the one that he's married to and has the right to be with. So that's not wrong. He tells them, drink water from your own cistern. That's what he's saying. He's talking about the sexual attraction there. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul would mention that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, about that desire, the sexual desire, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and in verse 9, when in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and in verse 9 it reads, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. He's talking about, again, as you go through the context, and for time's sake we won't go through each line of it, but the context of 1 Corinthians 7 is about the marriage relationship. There's nothing wrong with that attraction. In fact, God made us that way. God made us that way. That's in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. As he talks about that desire, he said that he points out that they need to get married if they burn, instead of burning with passion. That's the way that men and women are created. Now, more particularly, men have that desire stronger than women. So, over the next few moments, it will seem like we're harping on the way women dress. These principles apply to men too, but men are the ones who are the visually stimulated ones. We'll talk about that more later on. But men and women are created that way. God made us that way. There's nothing wrong with it when it's in the marriage relationship. One being dressing in a way to be found sexually attractive. One finding a member of the opposite sex sexually attractive is not wrong if it's one's marriage partner. But to anyone other than your marriage partner, to anyone other than your spouse, to be dressed in a way to be found sexually attractive or to be sexually attracted to is wrong. That's a principle we need to understand. One can dress in that way, and God made us to have that sexual attraction or desire, but it is to be within the confines of the marriage relationship. Now, before we go any further, let's continue in defining and talking about sexually attractive dress by understanding what we mean by the word attractive. Well, before we define attractive, let's define the word attract. It's from the Latin word ad, meaning in the direction of. Right here, or to pull. To attract means to draw or pull toward. In fact, there's some related words. You may not realize they're related words to the word attract. The word tractor. Use it to pull something. It's actually similar and related words along with the word traction. It has to do with the pulling towards or drawing towards. So, that's the idea when dressing in such a way, as we'll see in a moment, when dressing in a way that pulls the attention towards them. Attractive, providing pleasure or delight, arousing interest. That's dictionary.com's definition of our word attractive. So we're talking about sexually attractive dress. Let's understand attractive and attract has to do with providing pleasure and drawing towards. So when we define sexually attractive dress, it's that kind of dress which draws attention of a sexual nature. It draws attention to the sections of the body that will arouse the sexual thoughts or interests. That's what sexually attractive dress is. It's the kind of dress that draws attention to the parts of the body, as we'll see later on, attention ought not to be drawn to. But that drawing attention to the parts of the body that would arouse the sexual thoughts or sexual interest. Now, let's talk about what the Bible has to say about the way that we dress. We understand what sexually attractive dress is. As we move through, we take these principles we're going to look at. We're going to see how dressing in that way violates these principles. But let's understand the biblical principles concerning how to dress. Let's start in Genesis chapter 3. Go to Genesis chapter 3 with me. You're familiar with the story of Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3 is where Adam and Eve have been tempted. And then, after they are tempted, and they eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they come to realize they are naked. They come to realize they are naked. And God's going to make some clothes for them in this text. And we'll talk about those clothes that God made for them. But before we talk about that, I want to notice something interesting. Sometimes we use the word, we talk about one being naked. And the idea we typically have is one having nothing on. But the Bible actually defines it here in Genesis chapter 3 as one being covered, but not appropriately. Look at Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7. Genesis 3 and in verse 7. Then the eyes of both were open, and they knew that they were naked. Now that verse, they're nude. There's nothing on them. Here's what they do, verse 7. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin cloths. Verse 10 now. Remember, they hide themselves as they hear the Lord, and then the Lord calls to them and says, where are you? And the man says in verse 10, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked. You mean you're naked? You're covered. Well, not completely. Not covered as they should be. And so they are naked in the relative sense. Their nakedness is exposed. What should be covered is not covered. So God then makes clothing for them. Verse 21. Verse 21. And the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skin and clothed them. So God clothed them. So they were naked. They had nothing on. They eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, realize they have nothing on. They then make loincloths, but realize they're still naked. They're not covered as they should be. So God makes clothing for them, verse 21, and now, when God makes it, their nakedness is covered. What He makes is a tunic that goes from the shoulders to the knee. Original ISB article on dress says the word chiton resembled the Roman tunic, corresponding most nearly to our long shirt, reaching below the knee always. And in case it was designed for dress occasions, reaching almost to the ground. Later in the article it is noted that the chiton of the peasantry was shorter than the modern camas of Syrian phila, which is to the knee. So the word here for the tunic that is made by God for them always came below the knee. Here's further. Freddie's Wright rather. Wright says the tunic, inappropriately translated coat. Your translation may say coat. If you write in your Bible, circle that word and write out beside it tunic. That's the better translation. That's the better translation that he's translated with put on a tunic. The tunic was a skirt which was worn next to the skin. It was made of leather, hair cloth, wool, linen, or in modern times usually of cotton. The simplest form of it was without sleeves and reached to the knees or sometimes to the ankles. The well-to-do wore the sleeves and extending to the ankles. Women as well as men wore it. Although there were no doubt a difference in the style and pattern and what was worn by the two. So as we go back and look at this word translated, inappropriately translated coats, better translated tunics or garments, the clothing God made covers from the shoulders to below the knees. That's the definition of the word tunic, which is what is that word that appears here, I believe is the word kutonet in the Hebrew language. That's what that word means, is that it was a tunic that covered from the shoulders down to below the knees. Now, as we consider biblical principles, let's not just consider the principle of the divinely made clothing, let's consider some other principles, such as what the Bible defines nakedness as. We said already, Genesis chapter 3, that they were covered with nothing, they were naked. They were covered with something, but not appropriately, they were naked. The Bible defines what exactly should be covered and what is considered nakedness. Let's understand that as the Bible defines, or let's understand first and foremost, that the nakedness of one is not to be uncovered except for their mate. We already talked about this some. That attraction, sexual attraction is fine within the marriage relationship. And one's nakedness should not be uncovered except for their mate. Go to Leviticus 18. Leviticus chapter 18, beginning at verse 6. Leviticus 18, beginning at verse 6. None of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover his nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife, it is your father's nakedness. You can read on through as you go on and talk more and more about the uncovering of nakedness in the text. But that is to be done as you go through, and it talks about these close relatives and everything that's only to be done for one mate. But what is exposing nakedness? What is the nakedness? What is exposing oneself to somebody else? Well, let's understand. Exposing of the thigh is nakedness. Consider this. The Bible, time and time again, talks about the thigh being exposed and thus one's nakedness being exposed. Real quick, dictionary.com, the thigh is the part of the lower limb in humans between the hip and the knee. So again, let's go back to our principle of biblical clothing. So when one is dressed, it needs to be covered. We know exposing the thigh is nakedness, so it needs to cover to below the knee. That's the principle laid out in the Scriptures, because the thigh is not to be uncovered. Case in point, Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7. They were naked. Then they covered themselves with loincloth. They were naked. And it wasn't until God clothed them with something that covered their thigh. They were no longer naked. Go to Exodus chapter 28 with me. Exodus chapter 28. And in verse 42. Exodus chapter 28 and in verse 42. Listen to what it said. You shall make for them linen undergarments to cover their naked flesh. This is the priestly garment. He says, when you make the priestly garment, you shall make undergarments that cover their nakedness. Shall cover their naked flesh. They shall reach from the hips to the thighs. You're covering their nakedness. What's to be covered? Well, the hips and the thighs. Down to the thighs is supposed to be covered. Again, coming back to our same principle. That is below the knees is Genesis chapter 3. Then go with me as well to Isaiah chapter 47. Isaiah chapter 47. Verses 1 through 3. This is actually a foretelling of the humiliation of Babylon. But in this, an analogy is used. And the principle used in the analogy is the principle we need to understand. Verse 47 beginning. Come down and sit in the dust. Chapter 47, verse 1 of Isaiah. Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans. For you shall no more be called tender and delicate. Take the millstones and grind flour. Put off your belt. Strip off your robe. Uncover your legs. Pass through the rivers. Your nakedness shall be uncovered. And your disgrace shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will spare no one. Uncover your legs, or shall we say, uncover your legs. Your nakedness is thus exposed. Which brings us back to the principle that one's thighs are to be covered, and exposing of one's thighs is considered nakedness. Now, we're considering biblical principles when it comes to the way that one dresses. We know what divinely made clothing is. It was this kutonet, or this tunic, as it's translated, that covered down to below the knees. The exposing of one's thigh is considered nakedness. Now let's consider the principles of 1 Timothy chapter 2, 9 through 10. 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 10, the passage that Cole read for us earlier. 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 10. If you want to go ahead and turn in there, let's understand the principles. We'll read it again. Likewise also, that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. So let's understand here, as we talk about 1 Timothy chapter 2 and the principle of one's dress, one needs to dress in a modest, or some translations will translate that word, such as the ESV does, respectable apparel. W.E. Vine says that this word rendered modest or respectable means orderly, well-arranged, decent. The well-ordering is not of dress and demeanor only, but of the inner life, honoring indeed and expressing itself in the outward conversation. And so what he's saying is, this word here has to do with being well-arranged or decent, but it doesn't just have to do with the outward appearance. It begins inward and then it expresses itself in the outward appearance. Third, says this word means to be well-arranged, seemly, or modest. Bella, respectable, honorable, kuba, modest, or respectable. So when one dresses, they need to make sure it's done in a well-arranged or decent manner, that it is in a respectable manner in the way that one dresses. But not only should it be in a modest or respectable way, it should be with propriety or shamefacedness. Some translations translate that word modesty, but propriety and shamefacedness is a better reflection of what the word here means. W.E. Vine says this word rendered propriety or shamefacedness means a sense of shame, modesty. Shamefastness is that modesty which is fast or rooted in the character. Strong suggests that it may be from two words which would give the idea of a downcast eyes or bashfulness. So let's back up here for a second and see what we're defining. The idea is one dresses in a way that with these downcast eyes or a sense of shame or modesty, as opposed to dressing in a way as though they have no shame. In fact, wasn't that the problem with Jeremiah's day? The people forgot how to blush. What the Bible is saying about the way that we dress is we dress in a way that is modest or shamefacedness. That's with downcast eyes. We dress in such a way so as to not be shameful. And that's what's rooted in our character. Then we have the word moderation, or sobriety, or self-control, depending on your translation. Vines again says it means a soundness of mind, sound judgment. Practically expresses the meaning. It is the habitual inner self-government with its consistent reign of all the passions and desires which would hinder the temptation to these from arising. Strong says it means a soundness of mind, sanity, or self-control. So the way that we dress is going to have to reflect some self-control, some sobriety in our thinking, and making sure that we're dressing in a way that is pleasing in the eyes of God. So let's go back to the principle. We talked Wednesday night in our invitation about what Paul said to Felix: righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. One needs to submit to the will of God, and that requires some self-control. Same thing when it comes to the way we dress. One needs to dress with some self-control. Perhaps there's a way that we want to dress, but we realize, just as we do with other principles, it's in violation of God's law. It takes some self-control for one to dress in a way that is pleasing in the eyes of God. Let's take another principle here about the way that we dress in 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 2, this time you've got to go back to verse 8, and then we'll connect it to verse 9. But it applies in every place. 1 Timothy 2 and verse 8. I desire that, therefore, that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. So 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 8 really have been dealing with prayer. Verse 1, first of all, prayers and supplications, prayers, intercession, forgiving of thanks, commands for all people, especially those in place of authority. He comes on to point out in verse 5, there's one God and one mediator between God and man, that is Jesus Christ. And so, therefore, I desire, therefore, verse 8, that men pray everywhere, lifting holy hands without wrath or quarreling or doubting. Verse 9, likewise also, that women should adorn themselves with respectful apparel. There's certain words we always talk about in Bible study. When you see them, go back. Therefore, go back. So verse 8, I desire therefore, go back to the context and see what Paul said about prayer in 1 through 7. You see the word for, go back. Likewise. Likewise what? Well, let's connect it back to the previous verse. This likewise, or like manner, or in this manner, that connects verse 9 and verse 8, has to be referring to the fact that it applies in every place. You go back and read verses 8 and 9, and you read between the two verses. The only reason for 9 to say likewise that I can see is that verse 8, I desire therefore that men pray everywhere. Verse 9, likewise, that is everywhere, in every place, women should adorn themselves in modest, respectable apparel. That's the connection between the two. And it's an important principle to understand. Sometimes we can set, if we're not careful, different standards for different places. And so when it comes to worship, it's I need to dress modestly. I'm going to worship service. And then we go out and you go to town, but that doesn't matter in town. And sometimes we define modest as one thing in one situation and another in another situation. There are people who say, oh no, this person wore something slightly above the knee at services, and then you'll see them in something well above the knee when you pass them Walmart on Monday morning. Let me tell you, the principle applies in every place. And this is important too, in every situation. What may be modest in one situation, and I'll define this more in a second, may not be in another. Here's what I mean by that. We say, okay, dress needs to come below the knees, and perhaps it is while we're standing, but what about while we're sitting? Well, maybe wearing shorts and say, well, it comes below the knee while we're standing. But then we sit down and perhaps it doesn't. Or something may not seem so tight when we're standing, so as it exposes one's figure, but then you sit down and it gets tighter. You ever sit down and your clothes felt tighter when you're sitting down than when you're standing up? And then you sit down and it gets tighter. The principle applies in every place and in those situations. Just because it may be long enough standing up doesn't mean you're sitting down. Just because it's loose enough standing up doesn't mean it's not going to be too tight sitting down. We have to understand that because the principle applies in every place. And so it may be modest standing up, but it may not be sitting down. And we need to understand those principles. Let me tell you a fourth principle. A little principle we need to understand concerning how to dress. We understand the body clothing. It's a tunic that comes from the shoulders to below the knees. The principle is the thigh is not to be exposed, one's nakedness is not to be exposed. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Be respectable, be modest, exercise some self-control, and remember these principles apply in every case. And number 4, or I guess the letter D, men and women think differently. We say, I know that. And we understand that. The Bible would point that out. Do you know that the fact that men are more visually stimulated than women? That is why pornography, you look at the statistics for pornography is a greater temptation to men than it is to women. Not to say it's not a temptation for women, but it is a greater temptation for men than women. Men are more visually stimulated than women. That's a principle we need to understand. Men are more likely to look and to lust. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 28. It talks about those lusts. In Matthew chapter 5, when Matthew chapter 5 and verse 28, Matthew 5 and in verse 28, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So a woman can't lust? No. But it's a greater temptation to Proverbs chapter 16, verse 25, her beauty can be a temptation. Again, Proverbs 5, 6, and 7, Solomon is warning his son to flee the immoral woman. Does that mean there's not immoral men? Does that mean that a woman doesn't need to flee from an immoral man? No, she needs to flee from an immoral man. But in general, it's the men who are more visually stimulated and tempted to this. Verse 25, do not desire her beauty in your heart, and do not let her capture you with her eyelashes. Well, pornography is greater temptation to men that are more visually stimulated than women. Understand this, ladies, it doesn't take much visually to arouse a man's sexual interest in you, even a hint or a glimpse. We'll see more about that later on with an interview that Gary Henry, preacher, actually had with a prostitute one time on a bus ride. And I'll explain more about that later on. And she explains about the way they dress to arouse those thoughts in men. But it doesn't take much visually to arouse a man's sexual interest in you. Now it is true there are men with dirty minds. 2 Peter 2 and in verse 14. There talks about 2 Peter chapter 2, those with dirty minds. It is true there are men with dirty minds. You can't look at the world around and not see that such is the case. It doesn't remove the responsibility for how one dresses. There are good godly men who are trying their best, who, when they see sexually attractive dress, have to fight the sexual thoughts, and some have given in. And even ruin families in it. And sometimes it begins because of what one sees. So that's the biblical principles we need to understand about how we dress. The clothes that God made in Genesis chapter 3, that covered from the shoulders to below the knees. These clothes from the thighs nakedness. The principles of 1 Timothy chapter 2 that are laid out in verses 9 and 10. And we need to understand the Bible even points out men and women think differently. Let's understand this. Our clothing sends, there are lessons from our clothing. Number one, here's some lessons from our clothing. What you wear, we can learn lessons from. Number one, our clothing sends signals. Our clothing sends signals. Here's an example of that. Go to town today. I want you to think about this. Go to town today. If you pass somebody wearing scrubs, you're probably going to assume, you're probably safe in assuming, they work in a medical profession. Right? That's probably safe assumption if you pass somebody that's wearing scrubs. If you pass somebody wearing a police uniform with a badge on their chest and a gun on their side, you're probably safe in assuming they're a police officer. You may not even know the person, but you know how you know that they're a police officer? Their clothing was sending you signals. Right? You can tell something about somebody by the way they dress. And you may say, well, that's obvious that we can tell that when somebody's wearing a police uniform or scrubs or a fireman's uniform or so on and so forth. Yes. But our clothing can send signals even when it's not something like a uniform. Again, Proverbs chapter 7 and in verse 10, she was dressed with the attire of a prostitute. Didn't have to know it. To know the way she was dressed, that's what she did. Because her clothing sent signals. 1 Timothy chapter 2, 9 and 10. Our clothing can tell whether we exercise self-control, whether we are shamefacedness, whether we dress with modesty or respectable. Our clothing can send signals. And so you see somebody that's dressed modestly, it tells you that's somebody that cares about the way they dress. But sometimes the way that we dress and the signals it sends can be sexual in nature. That brings us back to the point at the beginning. That brings us back to the point that we made at the beginning as we talked about sexually attractive dress. That the way that one dresses can be sexually attractive, Proverbs 17. And the way that one dresses can send signals, whether we realize it or not. Whether we intended to or not. Whether you realize you're sending signals by the way you dress or not, you're sending signals. Whether you intend to send signals, or perhaps you just don't intend to send those signals by the way you dress, you can still send them. As far as men are concerned, it doesn't matter whether a young lady intended to dress in a way and realize they were dressing in a way that sent sexual signals. A man doesn't care if the woman intended it or not. has the same effect. In fact, you may even be sending signals by the way that you dress that you don't even realize you're sending. And you may not realize, you may not intend the signals that are being sent by the way that one dresses, but signals are sent. You can tell something by the way that one dresses. Here's another lesson about clothing. I think this is important to understand too. We need to understand how men perceive women's clothing. It's going to be a quote from a book called Male Factor. And this is about how men perceive women in the workplace. This book that was written several years ago on the Male Factor. And I made the print so small I can't remember the name off the top of my head of the person that wrote it, and I can't read it either. But it's the lady that pictures up there. She's the one that wrote that book. And this is what she learned about men's clothing in interviews. And among the thousands, this is a long quote, bear with me, there's several sections to this quote we want to look at. And among the thousands of men and women I have interviewed and surveyed over the years, I have found no subject, this was her findings in her study, I have found no subject more universally misunderstood than what a man thinks when he sees a woman overtly showing a good figure. It's interesting. All the years of study and all the people she's interviewed, and the most understood topic is that women don't understand the signal their clothes are sending, and men don't understand the intent behind the way the woman may be dressed. That there's some miscommunication and a breakdown there where they don't understand what it is concerning how one dresses. The woman doesn't understand what message she may be sending when she's overtly showing a good figure, she said. She goes on later on and says, we are frequently told men are visual. Go back to the point we had earlier, right? Men are more visually stimulated. Men are visual. But I realize that many women don't know what that actually means. According to brain scientists and researchers such as Michael some percentage of women, perhaps as high as 25%, are visual in a similar way to men. If you're in that category, you're more likely to instinctively understand the men's reactions. But the other 75% of women who aren't that visual have very little concept, literally, of how men see them. So, again, we've heard it said time and time again, men are more visual than women. Studies show that maybe as high as 20%, perhaps as high, could be lower, than 25% of women are as visual as men, which means, take 4 women, 3 out of 4 don't understand how the men are visually stimulated. She goes on later on and says, in 2001, when I was first interviewing a few trusted male friends for my job, this is the subject that woke me up to how much I didn't know about men. And ironically, the scene that opened my eyes placed my male character, Doug, in a conference room listening to a whiteboard presentation from a series of executives, one of whom was a woman. I described her as all business, but also as very attractive and wearing a suit or a blouse that showed off her figure in some way, a low-cut shirt or a tight skirt. Then I asked each man I interviewed, if you were in Doug's place, what would be going through your mind as the female executive makes her presentation? I was stunned to hear the men's responses. Hear the responses. Great body. Stop it. What am I thinking? Another. I'll bet she's using those curves to sell the deal. Here's a third. Look at her face. Look at her face. Look at her face. And 4. I wonder what's under that nice suit. Stop it. Concentrate on the presentation. I was a bit unnerved to hear these comments and others, especially from happily married men who were respectful of women. She goes on, the visual wiring men have presents a similar temptation that men say they often don't want and wish they could turn off, especially in a business setting. Their visual nature is highly attuned to and predisposed to take in appealing images, including images of an appealing woman. And if that woman is dressed in a way that emphasizes her assets, that fact is not only noticed, but often begins a train of thought that more men in business would rather not have. But their visual nature isn't something that can be turned off. They must work to ignore it. In talking to men, I found most were incredibly puzzled as to why the woman wouldn't want to avoid the situation. Why, the men wondered. Is a professional woman dressing in a way that is likely to cause people to be distracted and miss some of what she's saying? And the answer, of course, is that most women have no intention of causing that sort of distraction and don't realize that they are doing so. The male-female disconnect. This is still in the same book. To test the difference in men and women's perception in this area, I asked men what they would think if they saw women dressing in a way that emphasized or showed off her figure in some way, such as a low-cut top or a tight skirt. Then I asked white-collar women who said they sometimes dressed in that way what was actually going through their mind. Here are the starkly different results. 76% of the men felt the woman wanted the men around her to look at her body. Yet only 23% of the women actually felt that way. In other words, 3 out of 4 women said that was not what they were thinking at all. Let's go back to that visual earlier. About 3 out of 4 don't understand the way that men are visual. 1 out of 4 does. And so that would be invariably the statistics. 1 out of 4 dressed with the intention of drawing men's attention. That would probably be the 1 out of 4 who thought was more visual like the men. Among men, here it continues, among men who have female colleagues and who don't have a shirt workplace uniform, 58% say they see a female associate dressing in a way they find as distracting at least once a week. 12% say they see examples of that every day, multiple times a day, and most of the women in question undoubtedly intended merely to dress professionally and are not aware that their attire is perceived as visually distracting. Here's what one of the men said in regards to an outfit that tends to trigger a response of men. It's all about the curves, bare skin, and framed to the side of whatever is supposed to be covered. That is where a man's eyes will be drawn to. A tight outfit, a short skirt, a broad strap showing low-cut pant in the back where you can see the top of whatever she's wearing underneath if she leans over a bit, any of those things, and cleavage. So what we learned in this quote in her study is that men are more visualistic than women. We already said, we saw from scriptures that men and women think differently. And so, as we said, clothing sends signals, and perhaps not the signals a woman may intend. And again, these principles apply to men and women, but we're dealing with it mostly from the woman's standpoint, is the quote we're dealing with. And they may not understand the message their clothing is sending, but it's still sending out those signals. Now, I'm coming to that interview I mentioned earlier. Where Gary Henry, preacher, interviewed a prostitute. Years ago, Gary Henry was riding on a bus next to a prostitute. He was getting around a bus trip. He was in Nevada, as you can imagine, where it is legal. And he was getting ready to go on this bus ride. He was talking to the woman next to him on the bus, and she found out he was a preacher. And he found out she was working on commission on the weekends at a brothel. So she's working on the weekends as a prostitute. Gary Henry thought it was a good opportunity to find out about the words attire of a harlot or a prostitute. This woman works in that profession, so instead of asking some member of the church what their thought was on attire of a harlot, he asked an actual prostitute what they thought on the attire of a harlot or prostitute. I'll share with you, she said there are 5 ways one can dress. And it may shock you the response, or which one that they find the most useful in the profession of being a prostitute. She said one way they can dress is just reveal it. Just nothing. She found in the profession as a prostitute that was actually the least effective way to dress. Was just revealing it. Concealing it and reveal everything else. That would be something like wearing a bikini. That was a little more effective than just revealing it, but not as effective. Reveal it just a little of it. Maybe give a hint, a preview, a glimpse, something where they can see some, but not all. That was kind of the middle of the road. Cover it tightly just to show the form. So, wear something that's tight, you can see the form, but it's not giving it much of a glint. Not giving it much of a glint. That's more effective than these other 3. But the most effective is just simply, the most provocative, simply to cover it thin. She found in her experience working as a prostitute that covering it thinly was more effective than just totally revealing herself, or concealing it and revealing everything else, or revealing just a little. So covering it thinly, which is still revealing, found that to be more effective than just simply revealing one's self. I think it tells us something about the way that we dress, that comes not from a member of the church, not from a preacher, from a prostitute who found that was the experience and the way that one dressed and the message that it sends. Finally, let's talk about some arguments used to justify how one dresses. We talked about how dress can be sexually attractive, but there's nothing wrong with it within the marriage relationship. The Bible principles, biblical principles, such as the clothing God made, the principles of 1 Timothy, the principles of what nakedness is, and the principle that men and women think differently. And so our clothing can be sending signals we may not realize. Which brought us to our next point on the lessons from clothing. It sends signals whether we realize it or not. And men may perceive women's clothing different than a woman may intend. Let's talk about some arguments that are used to, quote, justify how one dresses. Perhaps there's something like this. If someone thinks something, that's their problem. That's the reaction you'll sometimes get. If somebody thinks something about the way I dress, that's their problem. Let me tell you, they will give an account for what crosses their mind. You'll give an account for setting a stumbling block. In Luke chapter 17, 1 and 2, Jesus pointed out the temptations to sin are sure to come, but woe to the one through whom they come. It would be better for you if a millstone were tied around your neck and you were cast into the depths of the sea, than you cause one of these little ones to stumble. You've heard me say it before. I don't know how I go out of this world, but I can tell you some ways I prefer not to die. And having concrete tied around my neck and being thrown into the deepest part of the sea is not one of the ways any of us are probably ready to go out of this world. Jesus said, he set a stumbling block before somebody. That would be better for us than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. I want you to think about 1 Kings chapter 21. In 1 Kings chapter 21 and in verse 25, it says, there was none who sold himself to do evil in the sight of the Lord like Ahab. You know, we talk about Ahab, we talk about how wicked a king he was, and all the terrible things Ahab did. And you can think back through the life of Ahab and things he did. And Jezebel, his wife, incited or stirred him up. He's going to give an account for what he did. She's going to give an account for stirring him up. And the point is that we need to understand that we will give an account for how we dress, and when it may cause the stumbling block, it can set before somebody. Yes, they'll give an account for what they've done, but we will give an account for what we have done. Then perhaps somebody will say, well, we can't know where to draw the line. There's some judgment. It's about judgment and what you think, and we can't set a line. Yes, we can. Are there some areas in which there may have to be some judgment calls? Yes. But God drew a line. There is a line. And it's not a line that changes for each individual. It's a line that is set because it's right here in the Word of God. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 21, he said, from the shoulders to the knees should be covered. If that's how God decided to cover, why should we cover anything less? In Exodus 28 and verse 42, he said that the exposing of the thigh was nakedness. So, the line is wrong. And here brings us back to the title of our lesson. Sexually attractive dress. That which is sexually attractive. Go back through all the things we define as to what that is. And realize that it may not be exposing oneself as much as one could think. That which leads to sexual attraction. And that which sets up for one to set that stumbling block. That is a violation of the will of God. And then finally, sometimes you'll hear, well, you can't find modest, attractive clothing. Maybe not. You can go online today. There's many resources online. Most of what we a lot of us probably own nowadays, or at least have gotten recently, we probably ordered online. We go online and order things. We go to the store. Go down, go north of here, go south of here, go down to one of the stores like a Hobby Lobby or a Joanne's Fabric or something, and you can get some cloth and you can make some clothes. There's ways. In Matthew chapter 7 and verse 14, Jesus pointed out that the way that leads to eternal life is not always easy. For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. But it can be found. God does not expect something of us that we cannot keep. If He expects us to keep His principles of modesty, there's a way we can keep them. Yes, it may be getting the fabric from the store and making it ourselves. But we can keep God's principles. And let's understand this, not only can we keep, we must keep God's law. He laid out the line. He drew the line as to how we ought to dress. Sexually attractive dress. Perhaps it is not as revealing as we once thought it may be. But we need to understand. The principles are laid out in Scripture. We need to understand the way that one dresses can send signals. We need to understand what the Bible says about the way that we dress and the line that it draws. Because it's not about a line that I draw or a line that you draw. It's the line that God drew. And that line cannot be crossed. As we're coming to a close now, though, this morning, we've talked about the way to dress. But as we pointed out earlier, the way that one dresses is an outward reflection of how one, of the inside of one. What we need to understand right now is that there's something else we should put on besides just modest clothing. And that is something else we should reflect, and that is living a life of Christ. And in the book of Ephesians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul talked about putting off the old man and putting on the new. And perhaps you're here this morning and you realize you're still that old man, still the man of sin. You realize you need to put that off. Put on the new man. The man that tries to do good. So if you're here and you've heard the Word of God and you believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, you don't repent of your sins, confess your faith in Him. Be buried in the waters of baptism, rising up to walk into this life, being the new man, and having the hope of heaven in your life. Perhaps you're here and you realize you're not living as faithful as you should. It's a sin of a private nature, pay for a private nature. If it's a sin of a public nature, you desire the grace of the congregation. We'll gladly pray with you before you forgot to pray. No matter your need, if we exist in any way, it's not before us together to stand.